Hey, welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
A weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 2, Jumping into Jarmusch. All right. Hey, Alex, how you doing?
Good, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's been really foggy the last couple of days here in
that weird Texas weather.
It's been a strange winter.
Yeah, it's actually cooled off here this past week. It's been weird. I grew up down there in Texas too, and it went, and right now I'm in New York, and it went from being like 18 degrees to 40 degrees, and 40 degrees used to be really cold down in Texas, and now it feels like I'm in the Bahamas up here at 40 degrees, and I am loving it.
Oh man, I cannot do that. I'm still too stuck on Texas's weather.
It's all relative, man. It's all relative. Anyway, so what movies are we watching this week?
This week we watched 2 movies from Jim Jarmusch, again from different points in his career. The first one is Stranger Than Paradise, which was kind of his breakout film. He had one before that, but it wasn't quite as popular or well reviewed as Stranger Than Paradise ended up being, and it really kind of revolutionized the indie filmmaking scene. And then the second film that we watched is Broken Flowers, which was later in his career, I believe 2005. It's almost became mainstream. It's a little bit more well known than some of his other films, and it really shows a growth, I think, in a variety of perspective, and yet a lot of similarities to Stranger Than Paradise.
Yeah, it's a good set that we have this week, especially with Stranger Than Paradise being the first movie out of film school, after he graduated, the first feature film that he made with a film degree in his back pocket, compared to 2005 Broken Flowers when he's almost 60 years old. And that's a really good comparison between the two that you get to see there. And you really get to see someone who's achieved not mainstream success, but indie success. And we'll talk about kind of some of what indie success really means as compared to mainstream success. But it's much, much different than the comparisons we saw in Spielberg movies. And I think it'll be a very interesting set of films to look at this week. Also, we're really anticipating. I know I'm looking forward to it. I believe you are too. The release of Patterson in movies, which is Jim Jarmusch's next film, and I think if you paired all 3 together, you'd have a really nice arc. Unfortunately, Patterson is not out yet, but I think we'll be making a couple references to it today, and we do highly recommend going to see it. As of now, shameless plug, but do recommend.
Yeah. So just to clarify, we have not seen Patterson, but just from what we know from the trailer and reading a little bit about it, we think there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of how Jarmusch's career kind of inevitably leads towards a film similar to Patterson, and we'll get into all that later.
True. And this is the second week in a row that we'd have Kylo Ren in some way, shape, or form related to the podcast. And I'm excited about that. I'm going to see how long we can keep that up to make this both a film podcast and a pseudo Kylo Ren podcast.
Maybe we just have to do like the 6 degrees of Kylo Ren.
The 6 degrees of Kylo Ren.
We can connect any film to Kylo Ren by 6 levels. It's in some way.
I love it. I mean, Adam Driver's in everything these days, so it's possible. It's possible.
Yep.
Anyway,
all right. Well, let's jump into it, shall we? So let's get your take on Stranger Than Paradise.
Stranger Than Paradise. So when I first heard about this movie, I've been a Jarmusch fan for a few years now, even though I haven't seen many of his films. But I've always heard that Stranger Than Paradise is one of his best. And what I saw when I watched it was not what I expected to see, even though I knew Jarmusch was has this reputation of being out of the box, very indie. His filmmaking style, his movies are very, very often referred to as weird and in a good way, almost eccentric. And Stranger in Paradise is very much that. It's very much a very indie movie. It's exactly what you'd expect someone coming off of that back edge of post World War II neo-realism, nihilistic movie making to make. But at the same time, it's got a lot of humor in it that I did not expect, but I really, really like.
So just to kind of clarify, when you say it's kind of weird, I wouldn't say it's weird in a way that some people might think of Tim Burton's films as being weird, but more in a way of, if you're not really paying attention to it, you might just think, well, what was the point of that? Nothing really happened, or there wasn't a big obvious story or character arc. It's very toned down and almost implied, I guess, a lot of the things. And that's one of the things that carries through both of these films that we watched.
Right. It's not a traditional mainstream movie in, I think, any sense of the word. It's got its own indie plot, its own indie structure. They do its own indie thing with the camera.
Let's kind of back up a little bit and just describe the film. So essentially in the film,
as much as possible as that is.
Yeah, right. So, but there are actually plot beats that we can latch hold of.
There are.
All right. So the film starts with Willie getting a phone call from a relative in Hungary. So he's an immigrant from Hungary to the United States, but I assume that he was pretty young when he immigrated, because he's very ingrained in America and very proud of his American civilianship.
Yeah, he's very
citizenship.
He puts a distance between himself and his immigrant status, for sure.
Yeah. So his cousin comes to stay with him for 10 days before moving to Cleveland with her mom. I think it's
her aunt. She's coming to America to live with her aunt, but she can't leave. She can't go to Cleveland for a small delay of time, 10 days. And during those 10 days, she has to stay with her cousin Willie, who really doesn't want her there. Willie is concerned that it'll interrupt his life, even though he doesn't do much.
He's a bum.
He doesn't do anything. I'm so confused. One of the things, my repeated thoughts throughout the movie was how do these guys make money, and they get to that later on. But but I would say it's about their adventures, but it's really not.
So it's Willie and his friend Eddie, who joins shortly after and meets Eva. And Eddie is kind of charismatic, kind of fun character who has a little bit of a fancy for Eva, but doesn't really turn into anything. No. So Eva moves to Cleveland after the 10-day period, and then Willie and Eddie follow her after Willie realizes that he actually misses his cousin and doesn't hate her as much as he thought he would. And then they all go down to Florida basically on a whim. And we won't tell you the end of the movie, even though I don't feel like the end of the movie is really a spoiler. Because as we'll get into, I don't think I think it's the real attraction of a Jim Jarmusch film isn't necessarily the plot points. It's almost like all the plot points are MacGuffins. They are almost inconsequential, but they generate reasons for the characters to interact and conflict for the characters, and you get to see this interplay between these really kind of deep, complex characters in seemingly simple situations that tell you a lot about them. I always feel like when I'm watching a Jarmusch film, I don't even know if I can call them deep and complex characters. I think they're almost simple characters with simple motivations that he uses. He's good at using cinematic technique to tell us what's in their head rather than dialogue and actions, which is more of the traditional way of telling us what a character is thinking and feeling. It's almost the acting is so deadpan in both of these movies that it really
Yeah.
takes what the camera is looking at and the way that the camera is looking at it to tell us what is going on in their heads.
It is deadpan. I feel like the characters are more complex than they're willing to admit, even to themselves. And I do agree with you that the films are more or less character studies, in which we get to see Jarmusch like show his really high skill at these techniques, both between the script and the camera and all these little choices, because every choice is so intentional, to dissect these characters and kind of show beyond what's going on in their conscience to almost showing what's going on in their subconscious and what they don't realize that they're thinking, if that makes sense. But
yeah, no, I could see that.
And I feel like because some of the plots in both the stories in both of the films that we look at, and probably the stories in a lot of Jim Jarmusch films, are on their outside fairly simple, even though if interesting. I mean, both the stories, if I were to give you like a one-liner summary of both stories, I think most people on the street would say, that's interesting, I would like to watch a movie about that. But if you watch the movie, you'd say the story is simple, but the characters are complex. And you get to see the complexity within the simplicity, which is kind of the magic of a Jim Jarmusch film. And I think something that he's really good at is saying so much with so little.
Yeah. So one of the themes in Stranger Than Paradise is this disillusionment with an ideal that you have set in your head, or even ultimately a lowering of standards, because every time they think they're going to somewhere that they'll enjoy more, and each time they find out that it's the same or worse than where they were. It's basically the grass is greener kind of a thing. So Eva moves to America, hoping that it'll be a better life than in Hungary, where she ends up hanging out with these bums who do nothing. And then Willie and Eddie go from New York to Cleveland once they get some money, because they think that hanging out with Eva and being in a new place will be better. And then once they get there, their famous line is, Cleveland looks just like New York.
Right.
And it doesn't physically look like New York, but in all of the shots, and this film is black and white, by the way, and the shots are so precise, and when they're in Cleveland, it's winter and there's snow everywhere, and it's just such a stark and barren landscape that you get the idea that essentially Cleveland is a personification of the barrenness and emptiness of their life in New York.
True. And that's one of the motifs in the film that they keep saying. Definitely that's the most prominent line, and that's when I noticed it. The one you were talking about, when Eddie's like, Cleveland looks just like New York. But they keep making references to how everything is the same, and everywhere they go, they do basically the same thing. So each location doesn't really hold a change, because they bum in New York, and they bum in Cleveland, and then they bum in Florida.
Yeah, and then in Florida, it gets them into trouble.
Yes, it does. I was not expecting the ending that happened, but
yeah,
it was.
It's very interesting. We'll throw that in the spoiler section at the end.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about the idea of nihilistic filmmaking and how that might pertain to Stranger Than Paradise?
Yeah. So, like we said in the film, there's not really a cohesive plot or something. I mean, you can clearly break it down into 3 acts, I suppose, because each location that they spend time in is one act. They start in New York, which is Act 1. We get to see what their lives are like and what their relationship with Eva is like. And then Act 2 is they go to Cleveland. They spend some more time with her. They realize, oh, it's the same thing. They try one more time to have a more interesting life, and they go to Florida, and that's Act 3, where everything falls apart. But other than that, there's not really a plot. There's a lot of things that happen, but there's not things that build on one another necessarily. And this can kind of be traced back to the American New Wave of films like Easy Rider, which is
Bonnie
also
and Clyde.
Yeah, almost plotless, nihilistic films that things happen, the ending is sad, and that's kind of it, and it leaves you hanging. And it feels like that. It's not quite as depressing an ending as some of those films, but it definitely has that vibe. And I would also mix in European New Wave films like Bicycle
The French
Thieves.
New Wave and
French New Wave, Italian post-war films.
Right. And those were the movies that were coming out when Jarmusch was a kid and then a teenager
and developing in his film career.
Right. And I haven't read any articles to this effect, but I'm willing to bet that those were a ginormous influence on him. And of course he went to NYU Film School, which in the 70s and 80s was basically the cutting edge of indie filmmaking. And you saw a lot of that in New York. A lot of indie filmmakers split off and try to make their own thing separate from the Hollywood mainstream. And I think when we're talking about a plotless movie, it does have a plot. The structure is different than what you'd call your typical 3-act structure. If I always think of it as the witch's hat plot. I don't know if you do, because that's the way I was taught it in grammar school
or whatever.
Right. It's the hook and then the building action and then the climax and the falling action and the end. Or I might have mixed those up, but it doesn't follow that plot structure. It kind of just meanders.
It's more of a flat line with a drop off.
That's true. That's true. And the tension, the tension and release doesn't come from actions so much as feelings in movies like this. So we get to see their actions tense up, and then sometimes we get a satisfactory emotional climax. And I think we definitely do in Broken Flowers. I'm not 100% that we do in Stranger Than Paradise, but we do get a meaningful ending that drives home, I think, the point of the movie.
Yeah, I think it's a cautionary tale, if you want to call the ending anything, in the fact of these people have no purpose in their lives, and it ends up scattering them to the winds, if you will. So yeah, and this is I kind of have an issue with this kind of filmmaking, because I do think that these films have an ending. They're a little ambiguous, but I mean, if you're watching and paying attention, it does have an ending. But I think it opened up the door to films, especially modern kind of short film, indie filmmaking, which is kind of on a kick of having ambiguous endings that really have no purpose. Like it just stops, and that's supposed to be, oh, make up your own ending. It's like, no, you need to resolve it in some way. There needs to be some kind of finish where I don't have to like create the last act of the story in my head, because I could go a million different ways.
Right. And I think, I think a lot of that comes from a misinterpretation of how these movies, or just of this style of movie from the 60s and 70s in America, because the ending, I think the ending of this movie, like you said, it's very clear this obviously has an ending, and it does deliver I think a big swift kick in the pants for each of our characters, and we can talk to that talk about that a little bit more in the spoiler section. But I do think that this Jarmusch does a good job of giving his films a satisfactory ending, even if I know you were a bit confused with Broken Flowers, and I know the first time I watched Broken Flowers I was really confused. So sometimes it takes multiple watches to get it, but it's a very layered approach, and I think it works.
Yeah, and I can appreciate a film that actually has an ending, even if it makes you kind of work for it a little bit after you've left the theater.
Right, there's nothing wrong with a movie making you think.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to Broken Flowers now.
Broken Flowers. At first I thought it was a Bill Murray vehicle, but it's more than that. It is the story of a very, I don't want to call him super old, but definitely late middle age man who has had a very Don Juan lifestyle. In fact, his name is Don Johnston with a T. And
that's
he's been
gag throughout the film.
Yeah, that's a running gag throughout the film. He has to remind people that his name isn't Don Johnson, but he has been with many women over the course of his life. He's made it rich in the computer industry. He's had a very fun lifestyle up to this point, no commitments really. And then suddenly one day he is delivered a strange pink envelope in the mail that is from a mystery woman who says that they used to be together a long time ago, and now he has a 20-year-old son who is ran away from home and is trying to find Don Johnston, who he thinks is his father, and this woman is saying he is his father. And the rest of the movie is Don Johnston partially being coerced by his friend and partially on his own initiative, even if he doesn't realize it, searching for the woman who might be his baby mama, and kind of his internal struggle to think about the road not traveled, and does he actually want a family, and is that even possible at this point in his life? Is that still an option for him, and is he okay with that?
Yeah, it's kind of a journey of regret, almost, in a sad kind of way. A journey where Bill Murray realizes that if he were younger, he might choose different priorities in his life that would give his current life more meaning. Which is true. It's the beginning of the film where we're seeing what his life is right now is interesting, because literally every time we see him in his house, all he's doing is sitting on the couch or sleeping on the couch. He literally sits there when he goes home, falls asleep there, and wakes up there. And that's basically his life. That's all we know about his life. We know that he got rich on computers, which is a little bit of a cop out, but I don't think Jarmusch is so interested in people's occupations as their emotions and their mindsets.
Yeah.
He's not interested in people who are overly obsessed with money as much as what they do with it, I guess. Right.
And I think I said a little bit about this earlier, but I think his job is in and of itself another red herring, almost. Like it's inconsequential. It's a MacGuffin. I don't know if I'm using these words right anymore, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. It's just a way to explain the fact that he has the means to do everything that happens later on in the movie. So you're not caught up wondering how can he fly around all over the place. How he got his money doesn't matter. Right. Like he could have made his money off of selling squirrel food. It's irrelevant. He's rich.
But the thing that really stands out about this film is the cinematic rhetoric and all the techniques that are used to imply and to suggest what's going on inside Bill Murray's head, because he says very little throughout the film, honestly, and he expresses even less, if that's possible.
Right.
So
Because Bill
it's
Murray,
up to,
I mean, it's a perfect pairing because Bill Murray is the master of sad deadpan, and Jarmusch is the master
it's ironic
deadpan director.
because Bill Murray is also one of the masters at overly expressive and flamboyant comedy, in terms of, like, if you look at Groundhog Day and What About Bob and stuff like that,
True.
where he goes crazy. But he really balances that. I don't know if there's an in between for Bill Murray between deadpan and overly exuberant.
True. I think the real point I'm trying to make here, Jonathan, is that I love Bill Murray. And
Okay,
I just
fair
wanted
enough.
to gush a little bit about how
There you
awesome
go.
Bill Murray is. And I could watch him be funny or watch him be sad all day long. Because sometimes you want to laugh, and sometimes you just want to be sad with Bill Murray.
Yep.
That's
Yeah, I can see
about
that.
all you need to know from this episode, I think.
Okay, that's it. We're done. We move on.
That's it. Yep, that's a wrap. Nothing else.
No, we have lots to talk about this movie.
That's true. That's true, because there's so much. And I think for someone who's never studied film, and I'm very jealous because I don't have those eyes anymore, and I really wish I did. I wish I could flip on my amateur glass or my novice glasses and watch a movie like I didn't know anything about filmmaking. But I know for someone who does know about filmmaking, you can see in every single scene a million small choices that don't stick out individually, but they fit together so darn well. And I felt myself coming away from every scene just like flabbergasted by how well crafted it was. Like the choice of long shots, not cutting often, so each little cut means a lot. And the choice of set decoration and the pink motifs and the flower motifs and the crafty dialogue.
You definitely get the sense that every single thing on the frame was put there for a reason. And so if you have that vocabulary like we've been trying to develop, you can almost tell what's going to happen before it does. For example, the scene he goes to one of his old girlfriend's houses, which is completely white and square, and everything is pristine and literally the most picture perfect shots you can imagine. And I was like, I know that she has no kids. She's not the one that he's looking for, because the cinematography of this scene is so sterile. It was just removed of all emotion and almost all color, and it really tells you what's going on without even hearing what they're saying.
Right. That was a really good scene. I did love that scene.
And
Anyway,
each
and one of the things-
each
the
girl's
thing-
house that he goes to does that. Her environment sets up her emotional state of mind, I guess.
Oh yeah, each department is so in sync with one another. The overall crafting of the film, of bringing together the cinematography and the set design, and the acting and the directing and the writing. Jim Jarmusch is a writer-director. So Broken Flowers, he wrote based on an idea he got from a friend apparently, but he did write the script. So he is totally in control of every minute detail. And you can, and I don't know, I'm not saying he's a micromanager. I'm just saying I'm sure he has a crew that he trusts and works with often. But
yeah, here's a part of an interview that I read that I'll include a link to.
Yeah, go for it.
In the blog post. But basically the magazine is interviewing him and says, this is right after Stranger Than Paradise came out, so this is going back a bit, but it gives you his mindset. And the interviewer says, "You're the hottest name in town right now. Are you getting calls from the executives?" And he says, "Yeah, I am actually, but I'm not interested in doing that." And the interviewer says, "Why?" It says, because I want to have complete control over my work and I want to make small steps. I don't want to jump into something over my head. I don't want to work with union crew or have someone telling me how to cut my film or who's going to be cast in it. And also because I have the opportunity to make my next 1 or 2 projects with European co-productions, which gives me part or hopefully half ownership in my own film. So it just makes a lot more sense for me to keep it under control and make steps as I go instead of jumping into some kind of studio production, which is not interesting to me right now. Which really, I think this quote really shows you his mindset and explains his whole career, essentially, because this was at the beginning of his career. And yet, even to this day, Patterson is being released through independent studios, which is kind of an interesting thing that's happening nowadays. But it's very much that auteur mindset of, I'm only going to make connections that are not going to jeopardize my control over my art.
True. Yeah. The whole idea of the film auteur as the writer director who can really control the story. You don't have to worry about somebody looking over your shoulder while you're making the movie. You can just focus on your craft, and you can see that development between Stranger Than Paradise and Broken Flowers, which came out 21 years after Stranger Than Paradise, and you can tell what he's talking about in that interview that you just read. Jonathan worked out for him really well. He's made indie movie after indie movie after indie movie on his own terms, and been able to stay relevant and stay busy and keep making the things that he wants to make in the industry, which is really impressive.
Yeah. So one thing about Broken Flowers that I found interesting just reading through both of our notes and comparing them is that you noticed a lot of contrasts in the film, whereas I noticed a lot of parallels and mirroring, which is cool because they're both in there, but we both latched onto and took away different sides of that storytelling.
Yeah, it wasn't so much about contrast. Or at least in the thought. So I wasn't thinking that the big metaphors in the movie were about contrast. I think a lot of them were about drawing parallel lines between different characters' lives and emotions, and comparing and contrasting them. And the whole idea is, at least I think the whole idea is that Bill Murray is examining the path of his life, and then he's examining the paths of all these other people's lives, and in turn the possible lives they might have had together, and seeing how that works. But when I'm talking about, when I say that he directs a movie like he's writing a novel, is the sheer intent of his craft. So when he's making a metaphor, you can really tell he's making a metaphor. Like at the start of the film when he says, I'm getting into odd stories. And that's this part of the movie where the story kind of starts to get a little odd.
Yeah. Or we've just come from the first girlfriend's house, which was a very interesting experience. And I think he tells that to
with Lolita.
I think he tells that to the second girlfriend, and so we're like, yeah, you really are getting into odd stories, because his whole story is odd. By the end of the film,
I kept being struck because these things were so evident, but not in a way that I felt like hit over the head with it, but just like it was crafted so well that it's an impossible to miss metaphor. So it's so hard to miss that connection.
Yeah. So there's things like I guess he draws parallels in order to make contrasts. So there's a part where Bill Murray's sitting on a bus, and there's these two girls that are chattering, and they're saying, oh my gosh, he's so hot, he looks like a rock star. And we look over at this guy in the back of the bus who's dressed exactly like Bill Murray, but 20 years younger. and they're chatting about him, and Bill Murray is just observing this. And this is what I'm saying, where Bill Murray makes no expression. He doesn't say anything about it, but you can see that he's thinking, man, that was me 20 years ago, or what I wouldn't give to be 20 years younger or whatever.
Yeah. And this entire journey is him journeying into the past.
Right.
So, and it's
a loss of opportunities and a regret of choices that should have been made in the past.
Yeah. You know, that whole idea of the missed opportunity.
And what you were talking about as far as comparing people's lives, at the beginning of the film, we see a lot of Don Johnston's best friend / neighbor, whose name is Winston.
Winston.
Yeah, so his neighbor Winston has a wife and 3 kids, and is also into computers in a different way. He likes to solve mysteries on the computer, which is a kind of odd and specific choice because it plays straight into what ends up happening in the next couple minutes.
It's very convenient, but it comes across as quirky, and I like it.
Yeah, but you see the stark contrast between his family and all of his kids and Bill Murray, who again sits on the couch and does nothing all day. Mm-hmm. But they have some really funny interactions in almost absurd ways. Like there's a scene where Winston calls Bill Murray and is asking him about something, and then he walks into his house and picks the list up from the table that they were talking about, and but as he walks into the house, he goes, "Here, hang on," and he's talking to Bill Murray on the phone. And then he leaves and he goes, "Okay, sorry about that." And it's just the most absurd thing. And there's another one where they're eating lunch, and we know that Bill Murray is wealthy from his past inconsequential job, and so Winston puts down money on the table to pay for the lunch, and Bill Murray immediately picks it up and hands it back to him, and he takes it and puts it back in his pocket, just all rhythmically, without missing a beat and without saying anything about it. And it's just kind of sticks out, and it's hilarious. But I was also interested in the fact that it doesn't persist in quite the same way throughout the film. The film gets more somber as it goes along in some ways.
It does. And you can feel that in both of the Jarmusch films this week. Is that typical arc that you'd feel with a plot in a mainstream movie, like a Spielberg movie, like we were talking about last week. You feel in this movie in terms of the emotion rather than the action happening on screen. I'd say that difference is more apparent in Stranger Than Paradise, but it is definitely there in Broken Flowers, and Broken Flowers definitely has stronger plot elements, for sure.
Yeah, it's a little, but it's very similar in the fact that it's almost just a series of vignettes. It's not a bunch of action that builds off of each other. We set up at the beginning, okay, it's going to be a travel film. We know he's going to 5 women's houses. He goes to 5 women's houses and comes back. It's just like, it's very scripted, set out. Nothing changes much along the way. Right. Until we get back, and there's kind of a moment of revelation at the end. But still nothing changes. Like, maybe Bill Murray has realized something, but other than that, his life is almost exactly the same where he started. So again, yeah. it's that almost nihilistic but still introspective look inside of him.
They are both very internal based movies, so we're very focused on what's going on inside the characters as the camera's rolling. Certainly the physical action helps move it along and provides visual interest, but I think the real attraction is feeling along with those characters. And I think that's the most fun that I had with these movies was feeling what Bill Murray was feeling in Broken Flowers in a way that you don't feel the same thing that maybe like Indiana Jones is feeling when you watch an Indiana Jones movie. Like there's definitely a difference there. And I'm not saying that one's a bad character and one's a good character. I'm just saying the approach to the movie and the approach to what's interesting about the movie is quite different. And I think that's something that sticks out in a Jarmusch film and has kind of become his marked brand almost of these vignette style character studies that he's so good at composing. Yeah.
And in some of the Steven Spielberg films, again, he's more traditional in the fact of we know how how Indiana Jones or Lincoln or anyone in those films is feeling by the way they raise their voice or they stomp around or whatever, as opposed to just the back and forth cutting of point of view shots, essentially, of what Bill Murray is looking at and just contrasting that with his own life. And then we can see, man, he must be like, we look at the camera pans up a woman's legs and up to her face and stuff, and she's just sitting there doing a crossword, but we know exactly what Bill Murray is thinking in that moment.
Even though he's showing no emotion. It's I mean there's so much Kuleshov effect here, which is, you know, just something you see in a lot of deadpan stuff, but it gives the writer, the director, the editor, the big creative forces behind the story structure of the film a lot of options in how they cut and shape the scene. And do you want to talk about what the Kuleshov effect is, Jonathan? Do you want to explain that?
So there's a really famous description of the Kuleshov effect by Alfred Hitchcock, and he starts off by saying, okay, so imagine we start on a man. We just see him looking around, and then we cut to a shot of a woman playing with her 2-year-old daughter, and we cut back to the man, and he smiles, and we think, oh, that's cute. He's admiring this adorable little 2-year-old. And we say, now we take the exact same shot of the man and the smiling, but we change the cutaway shot to a woman in a bathing suit. Now it's more pervy, and it totally changes the tone of the last shot of him smiling. And that's really what happens a lot especially in Broken Flowers, in the fact that Bill Murray doesn't say much with his face, but what we see his eyes moving to and what the camera cuts to really tells us a lot about what he's thinking. Right.
And that comes back to just the mastery of the subtlety of the craft, and really the combination of elements versus the quality of those individual elements. Not that the quality is bad, but I'm saying that the creative ability to mismatch a deadpan shot and whatever, because like you said, with the Kuleshov effect, you could replace that image of the woman's leg with a slice of toast, and it would just look like Bill Murray really wants that piece of toast, man.
Yeah.
I'm hungry, man. I want some toast.
Yeah, Jarmusch uses the Kuleshov effect to express desire, which is a big part of the film, especially because one of the themes is, the Don Juan-ness of Bill Murray's character, and the fact that his, I guess, physical appeal is fading as he's getting older, but he still wants the same thing, and we realize that he has wanted the same thing his whole life, because every one of the women that he goes to visit look almost exactly the same. They're all white, blonde,
he definitely has a type,
same age. Even the woman we meet at the beginning of the film is young, blonde, so he hasn't evolved much in terms of his wants. And by the end of the film, we realize that maybe he would like a family, but we get the sense that he's too old and set in his ways, and it's just a somber ending.
Right. I mean, the male gaze is almost a character in its own right in this movie. Because Bill Murray, I mean, he just stares at everything, and that's a big the big cue to tell us what he's thinking, what he's looking at, and how he's feeling, and the cutaway shots that match, and especially, it sounds weird to say it in a podcast, but what part of the woman he's looking at actually matters a lot. And if you notice changes, starts off to be very sexual looks, but towards the end, especially with the scene in the flower shop, it's almost a tender, sympathetic look at the eyes instead of a look at the legs or something.
Even the first woman, I'm just going off memory now, but I think the first one of Bill Murray's girlfriends that we see is his current one, who's about to break up with him. But she walks into the shot with her suitcase. And tell me if I'm not remembering this right, but so the first thing we see is her legs and her suitcase.
Yeah, you see her legs walking in front of her suitcase, and
even
that's
before
what
Bill Murray looks at her, we're forced to see her legs, I guess.
Yeah, that's what they open on, and I mean, definitely that's how Bill Murray tends to think of women, it seems,
at the beginning, at least.
Yeah, for sure. And how he's lived his life so far, and that understanding seems to deepen at least somewhat over the course of the movie. But that's definitely the opener. You're right, and that's a powerful image looking back on it. And like I said earlier, and I do recommend this to you too, is that these movies only get better with rewatching, because there's so many layers to it and so many things that each scene could mean, and not in a contradictory way, I think, but in an additive way, where you get deeper and deeper meaning each time you watch it through. And that was definitely my experience, because I'd seen Broken Flowers before, and got it and thought it was really great. And then I watched it again and I thought it was even better.
I can definitely understand that, especially with something with such blatant symbolism, and like there's no way you can get the symbols at the beginning until you have seen the end. So watching it again, even I just after watching it the first time, the film opens with Bill Murray watching a scene from the old film Don Juan, and I went back afterwards because I knew that would be symbolic, but I didn't know what it meant the first time I watched it. So I go back and it sets up every one of the themes in the film. It's got Don Juan throwing a flower to a girl. It's got discussion of age and desire and stuff like that. And it really just sets up everything that we're about to see, going back to our Spielberg intros, I guess.
No, you're totally right. And that's what I meant when I'm saying that I think of the way Jim Jarmusch directs a film like a really, really great author writing a book, is that the imagery and the crafting, or what would be a literary element in a book, or a literary technique, is a cinematic technique, of course, in a movie. But
and that's why I call it cinematic rhetoric, because it serves the same function as literary rhetoric.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean. That is cinematic rhetoric. Right on.
Yeah. I have a feeling we're going to use that term a lot in this podcast.
Oh, I'm sure. Because
that's
it's
kind
awesome.
of the point of this podcast, is to notice those rhetorical devices and what they add and tell us in a film without even looking at the script and what is literally told to us.
Right. And the best way to learn how to use those is to see how other really great people use those.
Yeah.
And see the good uses of it. And definitely a Jim Jarmusch film is just thick with them. Just layered and layered. And it's really worth it. Like, it's, if you're willing to dig into a movie, I would recommend Broken Flowers or any other Jim Jarmusch film front and center. Worth the time. Yeah,
so if you're okay on Broken Flowers, I think I'm going to jump into the spoiler section. Overall Jarmusch notes. So I want to go back to Stranger Than Paradise, because he bookends that film as well. So, but in order to do that, we got to talk about the ending of Stranger Than Paradise.
Right.
So at the end of Stranger Than Paradise, they've settled into this motel room. They've been there for probably a week or so. And at some point, they blow or Eddie and Willie anyway, they leave Eva back in the motel, but they blow all their money on dog races. So now they've got no way to get back to New York. And Eva's not doing anything. The guys are going out and gambling every day, and she's just kind of left to wander aimlessly around Florida, which is just as barren and strange a landscape as Cleveland or New York was.
Yeah, and not even Miami, Florida, like she points out, like middle of nowhere, Florida.
Yeah, just somewhere along the coast that doesn't even have a name. We don't even know where they are. We just see a sign that says "Welcome to Florida."
It's quintessentially anywhere America.
Yeah, anywhere that has a beach. So through a weird ex machina effect, Eva ends up with a bunch of drug money essentially, and and so she decides that she's had enough of this weird journey with the guys who started leaving her out of things. And so she writes a note and tells them that she's hopping a plane back to Hungary. And so the guys get back and they've won all their money back at the horse races and they're super excited. And then they see the note. So they race to the airport where Willie gets a ticket to get on the plane so that he can get Eva off the plane. And Eddie is left at the car to pick them up. And then we see plane flying away. Eddie realizes that Willie is on the plane. We assume with Eva until we cut back to the motel and we see Eva in the motel. So we're left with the pretty clear assumption that Willie ends up in Hungary, Eddie goes back to New York, and Eva is stuck in Florida. But
right.
The second to last shot of the whole film is Eddie standing with his car, watching a plane fly away, which echoes the first shot of the film, which is Eva standing with her bags as a plane lands and then another one starts to take off. And so it's just this really nice bookend of these kind of traveling motifs, which seems to be a thing in all of Jarmusch's films, even going into Patterson, which I think we're about to get into. But just showing that moving places isn't going to change your situation because you basically take that with you wherever you go. And I think that's also another theme that carries through both of these films.
Right. They're both almost circular plots or circular stories because both characters or all the characters almost end up back where they started, both in terms of shots, like the cinematography, and especially in the case of Broken Flowers, in terms of theme. Or, what? I'm going to say both. Both movies, in terms of theme, they end up back where they started. In Stranger Than Paradise, they're aimlessly drifting at the beginning, and at the end, they're aimlessly drifting. Yeah. And in Broken Flowers, Don Juan is a perpetual bachelor who is kind of unsatisfied with his life, and at the end, he is still a perpetual bachelor who's unsatisfied with his life.
Who knows that he's unsatisfied with his life. Yeah.
Yeah, back with the same girlfriend who left him at the start of the movie too.
Yep. So nothing changes except now he realizes what he's missing out on more clearly than he did at the beginning. So, I mean, we can see how both of these films sort of lead up to Patterson, in the fact that what we know about Patterson so far is that there's a bus driver named Patterson in city named Patterson, and he writes poetry.
He's played by our boy,
he's played by Adam Driver, and he writes poetry about the people that he interacts with. He's married. Is he married or are they just living?
He's married.
I think we assume they're married.
I remember in the ASC article they're married.
Okay.
They're supposed to be foils. He's supposed to be very calm and down to earth, and she's supposed to be very eccentric and flighty. And
Two
he's
different
very
kinds of
stuck
artists.
in his right, and he's stuck in his routine, even though he sets aside time every day to write poetry in the park. And she's very all over the place and wants to do this one day and do that the next day. And I'm actually not sure what the main plot of the movie is. I almost feel like there isn't going to be, like you see in other trailers, like this is happening and they have to stop it to save the world, or save themselves or save their family. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to see another almost circular character study.
I don't know.
Patterson.
From the trailer, I can kind of what I pulled from the trailer is that it'll be more of a story where Patterson starts to see his influence on the lives around him, and that sort of inspires him and gives him more of a sense of purpose. Because even the trailer starts off kind of drab and then picks up to a more hopeful tone, which may not be an indication of the direction of the story. But I think that this one will end on a more clearly optimistic note than the two that we watched this week.
Yeah. I think so too. I think it might even have, although I do hesitate to say it, a happy ending. We'll see. Yeah. I could be wrong.
We'll have to see. We'll follow up. But the other thing about Patterson that we wanted to point out is that it's much more of a mainstream style of filmmaking in terms of the fact that it's digital. It's more coverage. It just looks more like a movie that you go to the theaters and see, and not something that you go to an art house and find. So Jarmusch is definitely kind of, I guess, caught up with the times, but I wonder if that comes at an expense of his original style.
Yeah, that wasn't super clear from the ASC article. And there was, if you're wondering what we're talking about, there was an article on Patterson in this month's issue of ASC,
American
Cinematographer. But it did sound like they were making that choice for budget reasons. And I feel like that is a side effect of being an indie filmmaker and catching up with the times. And definitely, being an indie filmmaker isn't all perks, obviously. You do get more creative control, but you also suffer from not having superb financial backing. And Jarmusch is no exception because he's so diehard indie, which is great for him, and I hope he stays that way. But he does have to shoot digital, which I'm not sure I agree is the same crime against humanity that many filmmakers think it is. But it is kind of sad to see someone who's forged their indie identity through just this love and diehard commitment to the film format having to switch to digital just because of the times.
Yeah, and even beyond that, just in the way the coverage looks from the trailer, is Broken Flowers had, and also Stranger Than Paradise to a lesser extent. I think Broken Flowers, they had more of a sense of what they were doing, and is very Wes Anderson. We both had a similar feel that it's similar to Wes Anderson, even though this is a bit before Wes Anderson's time.
Right. So if when we say this, we mean that Anderson probably drew a lot of influence from Jarmusch and not vice versa.
Right. It's just kind of a common reference point in the fact that everything is perfectly framed, often centered, that kind of thing. Whereas Patterson feels very, I guess, for lack of a better word, just normally shot in
I know what you mean. That you can see in the trailer a lot of like A cam, B cam, shot, reverse shot.
Yeah, angles and
put them on a third and a hot spot on like a closed frame.
And it's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. It's just very different from the more recognizable cinematography that like Broken Flowers and Stranger Than Paradise. Like, yeah, this is intentionally framed and centered and done this way for the style of the film. But
Right.
it is the same cinematographer. Patterson was shot by the same cinematographer as Broken Flowers, so it'll be interesting to see how they stack up next to each other.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. And you're right. I was very confused when I started watching Stranger Than Paradise. I think it was scene 3 when I realized that each scene was going to be exactly one shot, and that was it. I think there might be one scene outside towards the beginning with Eva walking around Brooklyn, looking for the apartment, where there's a couple different shots strung together, but almost all of it is a single shot, cut to black for a few seconds, and then a single shot.
It reminded me a lot of, even though this came out 10 years later, of the way Sling Blade is put together, where it's a lot of oneers and almost every scene plays out shots that take 4 or 5 minutes each. So it's just, that's one thing that I do like about Jim Jarmusch, is that he's not afraid to take his time. And we both noticed that, is that he will really linger with the characters and with the action and stuff, and not feel like you have to keep showing the audience something new in order to keep them interested. Like there's a whole, it's probably 4 or 5 minutes of Willie, Eddie, Eva, and Eva's date, I guess, sitting in a theater watching a kung fu movie, and all we see is them sitting in the theater with flickering light on them, and that's literally what it sounded like for 5 minutes. That's the only thing you can hear, and they're like passing popcorn back and forth.
And actually, I mean, it's a hilarious scene. It sounds like on its face, it sounds a little boring, but it is really, really funny to see.
I think there's one point in the couple minutes where it just like the fighting dies down, and it does like a little bit of a string score, and then it goes right back to 10 seconds later. Yeah, it's definitely played for laughs, and it was very funny. But just the fact that he doesn't feel like he has to keep switching shots or keep showing us something new to keep us interested, and he can he just relies on the film to do that.
Right. Because it's definitely been a trend over the past 30, 40 years to see more and more cuts in blockbusters, to the point where nowadays, if you go see a big summer blockbuster, there's going to be like 1,000 cuts or something per movie, like lots of little like 2-second shots or fewer, a few frame shots in there.
Which may not be a completely fair comparison, because I don't think this was ever intended or thought of as any kind of blockbuster or mainstream.
You're right.
It's definitely for
a
specific audience and different.
Yes.
But even art house films can get into.
Yeah, and again, I'm not saying
shot.
that one is bad and the other is good. I'm just saying it's a very different style of filmmaking. Yeah.
Especially if you're used to the modern blockbusters like people our age are.
Right. Like if I were to try to show your average 14-year-old a Jim Jarmusch film, they'd be like, why are the shots so long?
Yeah, they just get bored.
We've been looking at the same frame for so long. And who knows, maybe I'm underestimating the average 14-year-old, but I taught them for a while, and I really don't think I am. So
yeah, seems about right.
Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to talk about this idea I came up with this week of minimalistic filmmaking, which might not be the most accurate term. Maybe subtle filmmaking is a little more accurate. But it's definitely something that I thought about, and it was definitely in my mind as I watched both of these. I
think Jim you can Jarmusch definitely films. Call Stranger Than Paradise minimalistic. I'm not so sure about Broken Flowers, but definitely Stranger Than Paradise.
Well, I think, and the big thing that stuck out to me was in terms of score and how much there isn't one.
Oh.
In both movies, and I think that was the first thing that ticked for me, was when I realized that there wasn't wall-to-wall music in the films, and that was really fascinating to see.
But music is used very intentionally in both of the films, so it's not to say that there isn't any, but it's used very specifically, and they both have a similar funky music kind of obsession, and it's pointed out in both films.
It is like the very quirky detective thriller soundtrack that Winston cooks up for the main character's drive time in Broken Flowers as he's driving along from each of his ex-girlfriend's houses.
Constantly has this tape player with some kind of, I don't know what it was, some kind of intense jazz music on it.
It sounded like Nat King Cole, I think. Yeah. I could be wrong. But it's some old jazz, and she loves it, and she's always playing it, and Willie hates it.
Which is funny because John Laurie is a jazz musician.
Right. John Laurie actually wrote the music for Stranger Than Paradise. Wrote and performed.
That's
in terms
of that is definitely pointed out, but
that's my whole idea behind minimalism is using less to affect, or the idea that less is more, because when the absence is meaningful, and when you use less, each smaller item means more, therefore. And that kind of whole sentimentality carries through into other elements of the movie, such as the deadpan acting, and definitely in Broken Flowers, especially a kind of low-key lighting rather than a super intense lighting, with hard contrast on faces that look super intentional. And I know that this isn't necessarily your preferred style of movie, Jonathan, and I think we've talked about that throughout this podcast, is that we're not saying that, this style of filmmaking is better than that style of filmmaking, rather than we're trying to break them down and kind of see the interesting bits of each and what we can learn from this director style and that director style, and the whole deadpan acting, understated plots thing is definitely more up my alley. But I'm curious. I know this isn't your kind of thing, but I was wondering how you felt about it overall.
Yeah, so I will say what I really appreciate about Jim Jarmusch is I love symbolism, and I love, like we were talking about, cinematic rhetoric, sprinkling that throughout the film. I really love that. But the kind of nihilistic, deadpan, a lot of like filling the whole story with themes of loneliness and stuff, that's not as much my cup of tea. So there's definitely like give and takes to the ways that I would approach this. So it's interesting. And I'd like to see how Patterson shows another evolution, because this will be 10 years, or actually longer, 10 years after Broken Flowers.
Right.
So it'll be really interesting to see how Jarmusch himself has evolved from Stranger Than Paradise to Broken Flowers and now to Patterson.
You're right. To see, and I think one of the most interesting things for me is one of the things he's most proud about is that he's had so much control over his work over the course of the past 31 years since Stranger Than 32 years since Stranger Than Paradise. It's been a while.
Yeah.
But it'll be interesting to see the development over the course of that many years on someone who's had almost complete control over their work for that entire time, and see how you can develop yourself. I don't want to say in a bubble, but definitely a different venue than someone who's working in the mainstream Hollywood sense.
Yeah, being staunchly independent. And it's interesting that he's
we were talking about maybe doing a follow-up to this. So stay posted on that, and we will let you know.
Yep. So next week we have another independent director. There's my little segue.
We do. And this one's one that you know about, and I have almost no idea about. I can't even say his name, I think. So who are we watching?
Next week we're watching two films. I believe actually the only two films directed by Shane Carruth. I think that's how you say it. So Shane Carruth is very interesting. He is a director, writer, actor, and composer in both of the films that we'll be watching.
A man of many hats.
He is a man of many hats. So I'm very excited. These films are very different. They are, in a way, similar to these Jarmusch films in that you definitely have to think about them. And this might be a week to rewatch both of these films so that after
I
you've
was
got
already
it,
thinking about that. Because I looked into the descriptions for this next week and I was just intimidated.
yeah, it's going to be a fun discussion next week to see what we both pull out of this. So these are both two science fiction films. One is about time travel, and the other is about mind control. So,
Is that what it's about? I couldn't tell.
I'm not going to say much more than that because they each are an experience to watch, especially if you know very little. So I would
Okay.
encourage not watching a trailer for either of them and just jump into it and then probably watch it
Sometimes it's the
again.
best thing to do. Yeah.
But they're both available on Netflix, so anyone who's listening along can watch them for free if you have a Netflix subscription.
And we'll post the name of the movies on the blog.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or want to reach out, or if you end up seeing Patterson and want to give us comments, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger, and you can find spellings for both those Twitter handles on the blog.
Yeah, so we'll include that on there. And to find links about other stuff that we talked about, different articles and things, and also a video of Alfred Hitchcock explaining the Kuleshov effect, that will be on the blog as well. And the blog address is jssatchel.wordpress.com/blog. And we may eventually have a dedicated Filmlings blog, but for now, that's where you can find it.
All right, well, I'll talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.